The formation is ready. What's the next order?
We advance at dawn. Full coordination is key.
Understood. Preparing now. Listen up, team. The situation is critical. We move now or we lose everything. Gear up and follow my lead.
In the harshest corners of the world, where sand meets sky and trust is as scarce as water, power is measured in bullets and bravery, or so they thought. Some victories are won without a single shot fired. Some warriors carry words instead of weapons. And some heroes go unnoticed until the moment the world needs them most. When Lieutenant Mara Cade stepped off the military transport, the desert wind whipped through her hair and dust settled on her worn boots. She wasn't like the others. No combat medals decorated her chest. No intimidating scars marked her weathered face. She carried only a slim tablet tucked under one arm and a simple headset draped around her neck. To the battle-hardened soldiers of Forward Base Ironcliff, she was just another desk worker dropped into their war zone. The base was a fortress of frustration. For 3 long weeks, they had been locked in a brutal standoff with rebel forces hiding in the surrounding hills. Every attack had been repelled. Every negotiation attempt had failed. The enemy moved with precision that suggested professional military training, not the chaos of untrained fighters. Ammunition was running low. Patience was wearing thin. Hope was becoming a luxury they could no longer afford. Sergeant Marcus. Ruiz watched Mara approach the command tent with barely concealed irritation. Another translator. Another specialist who would tell them what they already knew in fancier words. He had seen dozens like her. People who thought understanding language meant understanding war. "She looks like she's never held a rifle," Private Collins muttered to his squad mate, not bothering to lower his voice. "He's probably learned her languages in some comfortable university classroom," another soldier added with a bitter laugh. "I'm sure the enemy will really appreciate her perfect pronunciation while they're shooting at us." Mara heard every word. She always did. But she didn't respond, didn't defend herself, didn't demand their respect. She simply nodded politely, set down her equipment in a quiet corner of the communications tent, and began her work. Her fingers moved across the tablet screen with practiced efficiency, pulling up frequency logs and enemy transmission records that most wouldn't even know how to access. Colonel Hayes, the base commander, gave her the briefest of orientations. His eyes were tired, his voice flat with the exhaustion of too many sleepless nights. "You'll assist with negotiations if they happen. Stay near the communication systems. Don't get in the way of actual operations." "Yes, sir," Mara replied, her tone calm and professional. That was it. No proper briefing. No questions about her background or capabilities. No curiosity about why someone with her skills had been assigned to this particular hellhole. To them, she was furniture. Useful if needed, ignorable otherwise. But Mara didn't need their attention. She needed their enemy's transmissions. And as she sat in the corner, headphones on, notebook open, she did what she had always done best. She listened. Not just to words, but to everything beneath them. The tone that revealed emotion. The rhythm that exposed command structure. The tiny hesitations that betrayed doubt. The careful formality that suggested military training rather than rebel passion. She listened to the enemy commander's voice, measured, disciplined, carrying the weight of formal military doctrine. She heard the response patterns of his subordinates, the respectful distance in their replies. She noticed the specific terminology they used, words that hadn't been part of rebel vocabulary for decades, and slowly, piece by piece, Mara began to understand something that no one else in that base had considered. These weren't rebels at all. They were something far more complicated, and that changed everything. The mocking continued over the next 2 days. Soldiers would walk past her station and shake their heads. The linguist, they called her, like it was an insult. Like understanding people was somehow less valuable than shooting them. She became invisible, a ghost in their ranks. Noticed only when someone needed a basic translation of intercepted chatter. But invisibility had its advantages. No one watched what she was really doing. No one questioned why she spent hours analyzing speech patterns instead of just translating words. No one wondered why she kept requesting older transmission logs, going back months before this standoff had even begun. Mara worked in silence, building a picture in her mind. A picture of who they were really fighting. A picture of why every attempt at resolution had failed. A picture of the one thing that could end this without more bloodshed. She just needed them to listen. And soon, they would have no choice. The desert night was cold and quiet, but Mara barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on her screen, tracking patterns, making connections. Somewhere in those hills, an enemy commander was doing the same thing. Waiting, testing, searching. For someone who understood the rules of a game that everyone else had forgotten was being played, tomorrow would bring fire and chaos. But it would also bring the moment when everything changed. When the invisible woman would step forward, when words would prove stronger than weapons, when respect would be earned not through violence, but through understanding that ran deeper than any of them could imagine. Dawn broke with violence. The hills erupted in coordinated gunfire that tore through the morning silence like thunder. This wasn't the desperate shooting of cornered fighters. This was surgical, calculated, devastating. Within minutes, 2 full squads were pinned down behind rocky cover, unable to advance or retreat. Supply routes were cut off. Communication lines went dark in 3 sectors simultaneously. Inside the command tent, panic replaced procedure. Officers shouted over each other, voices rising with each passing second. Maps were slammed onto tables. Radios crackled with desperate calls for reinforcement. They knew exactly when we'd patrol that ridge. Lieutenant Morrison shouted, his face red with frustration and fear. This wasn't luck. Captain Reeves agreed, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the tactical display. They've been watching us, studying us. This is an ambush planned by professionals. Colonel Hayes stood at the center of the chaos, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. 3 weeks of stalemate, and now this. Casualties were mounting. Options were disappearing. Get me a communication channel to their command. Now, we need to talk before this becomes a massacre. The radio operator worked frantically, cycling through frequencies. Finally, a connection crackled to life. Static, silence, then a response. But not what anyone expected. The voice that came through spoke in a language most of them didn't recognize. Using formal military terminology that sounded almost ceremonial, it wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a threat. It was something else entirely. The translator on duty fumbled with his notes, struggling to keep up. Sir, I think I'm not sure what he's saying exactly. The dialect is unusual. Some of these phrases don't translate directly to, that's because he's not speaking to you. Every head in the tent turned. Mara had stood up from her corner station. Her voice was quiet but carried absolute certainty. For the first time since arriving, she had everyone's complete attention. Colonel Hayes frowned. What do you mean he's not speaking to us? We initiated the he's testing authority, Mara interrupted, something she had never done before. She stepped forward, her tablet in hand. This isn't about information gathering. He's using formal challenge protocols. He's determining whether anyone here has legitimate command authority by his standards. Captain Reeves laughed, but it sounded hollow. By his standards, he's a rebel commander hiding in caves. What standards could he possibly? He's not a rebel, Mara said simply. The words dropped into the tent like stones into still water. Silence. Complete. Shocked silence. Colonel Hayes studied her face, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Explain now. Mara pulled up files on her tablet, showing waveform analyses and linguistic breakdowns that looked like mathematical equations. The speech patterns, the terminology, the response structure, none of it matches rebel communication profiles. These are trained military officers, using doctrine that hasn't been active for 15 years. They're using challenge codes that only exist between ranking officers from the old military academy system. That's impossible, Morrison said, but his voice had lost its certainty. It's not just possible, it's confirmed, Mara continued. I've been analyzing their transmissions for 3 days. They're not refusing to negotiate because they're fanatics. They're refusing because they don't recognize this command as legitimate authority. To them, you're not qualified to accept their surrender. The implications crashed through the room like a physical force. Captain Reeves leaned against the table. You're saying they want to surrender, but they won't do it because of some protocol technicality? Honor, Mara corrected, not technicality. In their training, surrender to anyone without proper authority is disgrace worse than death. They've been waiting for someone who understands the code, someone they can surrender to without shame. Colonel Hayes's eyes narrowed. And you think you understand this code? I know I do, Mara said. Because I helped write it? The tent erupted. Voices overlapped, denials and accusations flying. It was impossible. She was just a translator. This had to be some kind of mistake or deception. Mara reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small metal insignia. She placed it carefully on the tactical table where everyone could see it. The markings were unmistakable to anyone who knew military hierarchy. Director of Strategic Linguistics, Central Command, a position that existed above battlefield ranks, with authority that superseded even colonels in matters of international military communication and protocol. I was embedded here for a specific reason, Mara said into the stunned silence. Your tactics were fine. Your soldiers were brave. But you were fighting the wrong battle. They won't surrender to military force. They'll only surrender to recognized authority delivered in the proper way, by someone who speaks their language, not just literally, but culturally, historically, ceremonially. Colonel Hayes stood frozen, his mind racing through the implications. Finally, he found his voice. Why didn't you say something sooner? We've been losing people because until today, they weren't ready, Mara replied. They had to test your forces first. They had to prove to themselves that this wasn't a trap or a trick. And because authority that announces itself unnecessarily is authority that's already questioned, I waited for the moment when they would listen. That moment is now. Hayes looked at his officers, saw the mixture of shock and hope on their faces, then looked back at Mara, slowly, with visible effort. He stepped aside from the communication station. The channel is yours, Director. Mara put on the headset. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was calm. This was the moment she had trained for, prepared for, waited for. She pressed the transmission button, and when she spoke, her voice transformed. Not louder, not harsher, but carrying a weight and certainty that filled every corner of that tent and traveled across the desert to the hills beyond. She spoke in their language, using the formal military dialect that hadn't been heard in official channels for over a decade. She used protocols that only military academy graduates would recognize. She cited historical precedents, referenced commanders long thought dead, corrected a grammatical structure with deliberate subtlety that signaled insider knowledge. And then she issued a command. Not a request, not a negotiation. A direct order using the response code to their challenge, the code that said, I am your legitimate superior, and you will obey. The enemy channel went silent. 5 seconds. 10. 30. A full minute passed with nothing but static. Every person in that tent held their breath, wondering if this gamble had failed, if Mara had been wrong. More violence was coming. Then the radio crackled. A new voice responded. Higher authority than before? The voice acknowledged her rank, using terms that made the other translator's eyes widen in disbelief. The voice acknowledged her authority with phrases that translated roughly to recognized and honored and obeyed. And then came the words that changed everything. We will lay down arms at sunrise. We will speak only to the director. We await your final command. Sunrise painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the kind of morning that should have brought gunfire, that should have brought more death. Instead, it brought silence. A silence so profound it felt sacred. From the hills they came. Not running or hiding, but walking in perfect military formation. Weapons were laid down in precise rows, barrels pointed away, safeties engaged. Over 200 soldiers marched into the open ground with their eyes forward, their backs straight, their discipline intact despite their defeat. These were not broken men. These were warriors choosing honor. The soldiers of Forward Base Ironcliff stood along the perimeter, weapons ready but unfired, watching in stunned disbelief. This wasn't how wars ended in their experience. Wars ended in chaos, in last desperate stands, in the ugly mathematics of who could kill more effectively. This was something different. This was ceremony. This was respect given and received across enemy lines. Mara stood at the center, her head set on, her voice steady as she directed the surrender with quiet authority. She spoke to each group of approaching soldiers, confirming their ranks, acknowledging their service, ensuring their dignity remained intact. She wasn't processing prisoners. She was conducting a ritual that honored both sides. Private Collins stood near Sergeant Ruiz, his rifle lowered, his face a mixture of confusion and awe. "She didn't fire a single shot," he whispered. Ruiz shook his head slowly. "She ended a war with her voice. I've been in combat for 12 years and I've never seen anything like this." Captain Reeves, who had mocked her just days before, watched as enemy officers approached Mara specifically, saluted her, and followed her instructions without question. "They don't even look at us," he murmured to Colonel Hayes. "Only her. Like we're not even here." Hayes understood now, understood in a way that felt like waking from a long sleep. Because to them, we weren't. We're fighting a battle that didn't exist. She was fighting the war that did. As the last weapons were secured and the former enemy soldiers were processed by medics and security teams, Colonel Hayes approached Mara. The desert wind had picked up. Carrying sand and the promise of a cooler afternoon, he stopped a respectful distance away, waiting until she had finished speaking into her headset, and turned to face him. "Director Cade," he began, and this time her proper title felt natural, felt earned. "I owe you an apology. We all do. We underestimated you. We dismissed you." "We know," Mara interrupted gently. She removed her headset and met his eyes with kindness rather than triumph. "You don't owe me an apology, Colonel. You owe your soldiers something more important. You owe them an example." She gestured toward the soldiers gathering around them, the men and women who had watched the morning's events unfold. Most of them still don't understand what happened here. They think it was luck or some kind of trick, but it wasn't. This happened because someone took the time to listen. Not to words, but to meaning. Not to threats, but to honor. Not to what was said, but to what was needed. Hayes nodded slowly, understanding blooming like dawn. "You're saying we've been fighting with the wrong weapons." "I'm saying that power comes in many forms," Mara replied. "And the most dangerous assumption a warrior can make is that strength only looks one way. Those men in the hills were just as brave, just as trained, just as committed as anyone here. The difference wasn't capability. It was language. Not the language of words, but the language of respect, of culture, of understanding what matters to someone else." She looked out over the quiet battlefield where former enemies now sat together in the shade, sharing water, sharing silence, sharing the relief of survived conflict. Every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Every enemy has reasons you haven't bothered to learn. Every conflict has solutions that don't require violence, if you're willing to do the harder work of truly understanding. Sergeant Ruiz had approached close enough to hear. "So what do we do differently next time?" he asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier skepticism. Mara smiled, a small, tired smile of someone who had carried heavy knowledge alone for too long. "You start by never confusing silence with weakness. The quietest person in the room might be the one listening hardest, learning fastest, understanding deepest. You start by asking questions before making assumptions. You start by remembering that the person who looks least like a warrior might be fighting the most important battle." Private Collins stepped forward, his young face serious. "I said some things when you arrived. Things I shouldn't have said. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize to me," Mara said kindly. "Learn from it. Teach others. That's how we grow. That's how we become better than our first instincts." As medics finished their work and transport vehicles prepared to move the former enemy soldiers to proper facilities, Mara packed her equipment. The tablet. The headset. The insignia that had shocked them all. She moved with the same quiet efficiency she had shown when arriving. No fanfare, no celebration of her victory. Colonel Hayes watched her prepare to leave. "Where will you go now?" Wherever I'm needed next, she replied simply. There are other conflicts, other misunderstandings, other moments where the right words can save lives that bullets would end. She picked up her small bag and turned toward the waiting transport truck. But before she left, she paused and looked back at the soldiers who had dismissed her, mocked her, ignored her. Now they watched her with respect, with understanding, with the beginning of wisdom. Remember this day, she said, her voice carrying across the desert quiet. Not because I ended a war, but because you learned that war isn't always what it seems. The enemy isn't always wrong. The solution isn't always violent. And the hero isn't always the one with the biggest weapon or the loudest voice. She climbed into the truck. The engine started. Dust rose as it pulled away, carrying her toward the next impossible situation. It's the next underestimated challenge. The next moment when listening would matter more than fighting. Behind her, forward base Ironcliff would never be the same. The story of the translator who ended a war with her voice would spread. Some would embellish it, make it legend. Others would miss the point entirely, focusing on the dramatic surrender rather than the patient preparation that made it possible. But for those who were there, for those who watched and learned, the lesson was clear. True strength isn't always visible. Real power doesn't always announce itself. And sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is put down their weapon and pick up understanding instead. In a world that celebrates volume, be willing to listen. In a culture that rewards aggression, dare to show patience. In times that demand immediate action, have the courage to wait for the right moment. Because the most important battles are won not with force, but with wisdom. Not with weapons, but with words. Not by those who shout loudest, but by those who understand deepest. The sun climbed higher. The desert returned to its eternal patience. And somewhere in the distance, a quiet woman with a headset prepared to do it all again. Proving once more that heroes come in unexpected forms, that courage wears many faces, and that sometimes the person everyone ignores is exactly the person everyone needs.